Let's go on to the next lecture, and it's by Professor Yonatan Yovel from the University of Haifa. And there's a slight change in the title, A Critique of Nonviolence, Lessons from Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, and Richard Bernstein. Yonatan, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers and for you. I need to be standing like this. I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of my late friend and mentor, Richard J. Bernstein from the New School of Social Research, who died last year. About every line that I've been writing when preparing this presentation is something that in my mind I've been arguing about with him. So, in his book, Weapons of the Weak, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance, the anthropologist James C. Scott's fascinating study of class struggle in rural Malaysia, Scott, who was trained as a political scientist, describes resistance as both purposive action and a cultural form. Unlike many of the acts of resistance we heard about in these couple of days, that function in the public sphere in a struggle over legitimacy, the forms of resistance available to poor rice-growing farmers who face mechanized corporate takeover of their fields and livelihood are mostly unobtrusive. Scott describes how they unsystematically resort to persuasion, threats, false compliance, sabotage, curses, and slander. In their struggle against peers who cooperate with the corporate foes that gradually push them out of their ancestral lands, they may resort to coming at night and slaughtering the neighbor's livestock, or threaten with arson or magic. The interesting thing in the context of the present conference is that they do not maintain a sharp distinction, or distinction at all, between violent and non-violent resistance. Being deprived of political and economic power, they resort to the means afforded them by circumstance. Their choice of means is opportunistic, and there is no clear view that violence is inherently different from or an escalation from nonviolence. In my talk, I wish to offer some insights into the violence-nonviolence distinction, as well as elements of deconstruction. The background question I want to ask, and which I will not answer, is what separates the resistant from the terrorist? Should we attempt to answer this question agnostically, i.e. through a veil of ignorance as to the content of the resistance and what is resisted, or is shutting our eyes to the validity of the claim just a manifestation of radical relativism? Law seems to waver between the two, inventing the category of illegal combatant or insurrectionist, but law should not impress us as much at this point, not just because it is extremely statist and resistance is non-statist, but because since law knew the answer to the resistant terrorist question before posing it. Law pretends to regulate the distinction based on neutral parameters such as proportionality and respecting the injunction against targeting civilians. Carl Schmitt's friend-foe distinction from the concept of the political can easily be invoked here. It's a resistant if he's on our side. It's a terrorist if he's against us. Political power then becomes the authority to legitimize and condemn. As I was reading Scott's book, I was reminded of Patrice Lacan's historical drama, The Widow of Saint-Pierre, which some of you may have seen, where a remote island's fishermen expressed their resistance to and rejection of the death penalty through refusal to cooperate with the provincial authorities in executing a local murderer. No one agrees to act as executioner or assist in building a guillotine. When the authorities finally manage to coerce an outsider, a miserable refugee, a sort of wandering Jew, to undertake the office of bourreau, the most extreme form of resistance is that by the captain of the guard's refusal to hand over the prisoner or officiate over the execution. But the option of violent resistance to counter law's resistance is never evoked. C'est ainsi. This is the way it is, sighs the local innkeeper. When someone kills, the republic kills him. It is not a pronouncement of justice, but of something closer to fate, or to what Walter Benjamin, in his oft-discussed critique of violence, calls mythic violence. Right? Mythic violence is the notion that violence permeates the structure of social, economic, and political reality. Mythic violence projects a form of authority that requires no justification, that pretends to be a constitutive category of social reality itself. It is the form of violence that revolutions seek to overturn what Benjamin called divine violence. I shall return to this distinction presently. Before that, however, I should probably say a few words about violence, not as a concept, but as a practice, the materiality of violence, if you will. And here I must disappoint. My paper is not a diagnostic one that seeks to demarcate nonviolence and separate it from violence. Delineating the violent, nonviolent continuum, although very important in other contexts, is not vital for my project since I deal with paradigmatic cases of using violence, whether against the body, property, resources, infrastructure, or otherwise. Nor do I have a systematic set of criteria to offer for justifying violent resistance or to coercive political power, if ever. Instead, my goal is to problematize violence, offer a few insights from different contexts, claim that the question includes a hitherto unrecognized epistemological aspect, and finally read Arendt in a way that I think is a real contribution of critical theory to the ethics of resistance. I met the question to begin with, is whether the question of engaging in violence, again, I'm talking about the actual engagement, not the concept, is a political question at all. Arendt seems to recognize this question in her distinction between violence and power. Against the historical dogma of power as a form of domination, power over someone, that paradigmatically involves violence, actual or threatened, Arendt seems to seeks to reconstruct the notion of politics as empowerment, drawing from Aristotle the sense of collective action and participation. Empowerment involves discourse, deliberation, persuasion, the antithesis of violence. Arendt was enough of a realist to realize that her idealized notion of non-domination was rare, if not altogether absent from the real world, but I don't think she considered it utopian or far-fetched. She probably would not have accepted Benjamin's notion that law itself is saturated with violence, that indeed violence can be meaningfully conceptualized only in respect to law and to the state. She actually never wrote anything about this famous essay, The Critique of Violence. Albeit the close personal and intellectual relationship between them. Arendt accepted that violence was politically justified in extreme situations of a total collapse of the discursive system, but only in those, a point I shall return to presently, since Arendt does not in fact address the question of how we know when a given situation is exceptional in the sense of justifying violence, nor, for that matter, does anyone else. The medical political question is recognized poetically by Benjamin when he writes, "The commandment, thou shalt not kill." Benjamin has to be read in German, but okay. The commandment, thou shalt not kill, exists not as a criterion of judgment, but as a guideline for the actions of persons or communities who have to wrestle with it in solitude. And in exceptional cases, to take on themselves the responsibility of ignoring it. Ignoring, thou shalt not kill. Persons in solitude take on themselves responsibility. This sounds to me more like the writing of an existential philosopher than a political theorist. It resounds strongly with me personally. When the protests in Israel began to take the language of resistance, I find myself deliberately exactly in Benjamin's terms, not through discourse, persuasion, or collective action in the public sphere. I realized that I approached the question of engaging in violence, which is very different from its conceptual analysis, highly personally, indeed as a person in solitude. More of an existential question than a political one. For instance, I realized, not without a certain surprise, that while I fully endorsed the shift from protest to resistance, I personally am not willing to engage in violence to achieve political goals. Mine is not a systematic or even a principled approach. And like Arendt writes On Violence, there can be exceptional moments, for instance, self-defense, or more so, the protecting of others. Either those with whose welfare I am entrusted, or others, simply others, who are targeted by a hostile, violent force. In both cases, though, Benjamin's language of take on oneself the responsibility of engaging in violence resounds more authentic than the language of legal or jurisprudential norms. The normative language asks, when do I have a right to engage in violent resistance? Is there a causal relation between having a right to engage in violent resistance and a duty to do so. Norms are deontic. Benjamin's parable of the responsibility assumes in solitude does not deny the applicability of legal norms, but it does not reduce the experience nor the phenomenology of assuming responsibility to following norms. Does law exist in this solitude? It's difficult to deny. Only, even if it does, it doesn't assume the kind of authority we associate with law outside of solitude. That authority finally remains with ourselves. In that solitude, I may find that contrary to will and inclination, engaging in violence imposes itself, not to promote a political goal, but to save and protect. Yesterday, Professor Bezels, in his fascinating lecture, I want to make a small distinction from his last few words. In my natural law may certainly require the resistance, as he claimed, when lex humana fails lex naturalis, which is the aspect of divine law that is given to human understanding and cognition. But I wonder if that translates to a duty to resist violently, even if that is the only form of resistance available. To return to Arendt's much stauncher rejection of violence and explain how she saw total enmity between violence and power. And here we need to recall something basic about her view of the 20th century, because Arendt is highly historical when she writes political theory, something that is sometimes ignored. In On Violence, her late essay, after the origins of totalitarianism, Arendt separates herself from traditional political theory in several ways. One is her conviction that understanding totalitarianism requires a radically new mode or activity of thinking. We no longer can rely on traditional political concepts to inform us. This leads to there being no Arendtian model of government, and Arendt cannot be taught in the same way that we teach in the universities, say Plato or Augustine or Machiavelli or Hobbes. Unlike Schmidt's concept of the political that sees the basic structure of politics as ahistorical and acontextual, Arendt analyzes the major political phenomena of the 20th century, totalitarianism, as an entirely novel phenomenon, calling for a new kind of political theory. The ways in which the totalitarian state interacts with persons is not just historically unprecedented, thus presenting a perpetual risk and danger to free societies who must then protect themselves, not just in order to defend their values and beliefs, but because, and that's Arendt's main point, because totalitarianism circumvents the very nature of politics as empowerment. It is not a kind of politics, it is anti-political. And I think that this is a major notion that underlies a lot of the current protests in Israel, that the struggle is not over political positions, but over the existence of politics as such to begin with. The force that we are facing is a destructive force in relation to the possibility of the political as itself, not a struggle between ideologies. It is not perhaps, in this respect, so perhaps not coincidental that the authoritarian movement in Israel has rediscovered Schmidt's language of sovereignty, which, like John Austin before him, is extra-legal and pre-legal. For John Austin, sovereignty is a purely political notion that is necessary for both the concept and existence of law. So while Arendt negates politics with violence, thus considering violent resistance both incoherent and unjustified in normal cases, this does not mean that violence is always unjustifiable. We have to ask, when is it? How long do I still have? This is a bit long. Okay, good. Arendt wrote on violence on the background of the rhetoric glorifying violence in the 60s and the 70s emancipatory movements. Violence, she wrote, cannot create freedom, and the true meaning of revolution does not lay in violence. Specifically, she denounced the turn to emancipatory violence systemized by Franz Fanon. She especially hated Sartre's preface to Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the World, his famous 1963 book that was published just a few days, I think, after he died. As well as by the Black Panther movement, fringe groups of Maoists, or what she saw as misguided romantics who idealized Marcuse's critique of liberal capitalist societies that in her native Germany was mirrored in the frustration from the bourgeois order in the static political system that gave rise to such phenomena as the Baader-Meinhof group. Fanon, a native of Martinique, who immigrated first to continental France and then to Algeria, everything is still France, right? These are not colonies, joined the cause of the FLN early on. Les Damnés de la Terre, published a few days following his death, quickly became the standard manual for resisting colonial rule, including, and even primarily, violently. The standard view of Les Damnés is a work that not only condones violence in the service of national liberation from colonialism, but even celebrates it. Bernstein, claiming that Fanon's work should actually be read as a critique of violence, to a degree blames Sartre in his famous preface to the work. I quote from Sartre: when the peasants lay hands on a gun, the old myth fade. You remember mythical violence from Benjamin. This is exactly what Sartre is alluding to. When the peasants lay hand on a gun, the old myth fade. And one by one, the taboos are overturned. A fighter's weapon is his humanity. Killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, leaving one man dead and the other free. So death is not equated with life. Death is negated with life. Death is negated with freedom. Arendt saw in these words no more than a justification for terrorism. It is the very act of killing, Sartre writes, that liberates. But Bernstein denies that Fanon glorifies violence for its own sake. Yes, it has a community-forming function, and sometimes it is quite simply the only effective means. How wonderful for the colonialist to both oppress and preach nonviolence. Yet Fanon wrote less for the West and more for Africa. And he dreads that violence may become a habit, an all-too-powerful solution for everything, a means for domination and repression once emancipation from the colonizer has been achieved. Arendt believes that in principle, nothing good, politically speaking, can sprout from violence. Yet she does acknowledge exceptional situations. I imagine that she would not only condone but mandate acts of solidarity with oppressed political prisoners, for instance, even if those required violence towards persons and objects. The neighbor who attacks secret police agents that arrive to arrest his activist neighbor, she would say, is not only assuming responsibility and solitude in Benjamin terms, but acting morally. What about blowing up a train of munitions about to be used in targeting political foes or civilians? However, how do we know when an exceptional situation mandating violent resistance occurs? In hypothetical situations, we're in the classrooms doing these exercises with our students, it's easy. Because we can assume that blowing up the munitions train will achieve the desired effect with the minimum destruction of lives. But in real world situations, how can we be sure of that? I wish to impress on you that for Arendt, this would necessarily be a different question than how do we know anything else in the world? The reason is the aforementioned distinction between violence and power, conceived as empowerment and not as domination. Engaging in political violence is paradoxical, and paradoxes hurt rationality. Conceivably, the engagement must be proportional, that is, minimalistic in terms of targeting, destruction caused, duration, etc. Yes, all this does not solve the epistemological problem, how to know. The notion that grave decisions require extraordinary epistemological care, I like this term, epistemological care, I coined it. What? No. Okay, I'm going to skip the... Of course, when we have more important decisions in life, we demand higher epistemological bars. You know, when we convict somebody in criminal law, we have this fiction of having knowledge beyond reasonable doubt. Nobody knows what that exactly means. And however, we don't ask for that when we don't require that in decisions stemming from authority. For instance, we don't ask that people vote beyond reasonable doubt that they vote for the right party. That's really, really strange as far as I'm concerned. Regarding violent resistance, okay, I'm going to skip the part about the epistemology since, but I think you realize why that is one of the parameters that is very problematic, because even if violent resistance is justified and requires a superior epistemological basis, I'm not sure that that's very helpful in distinguishing the internal experience of the resistant from the terrorist. After all, the fanatic has a very strong belief in what he does. He doesn't have any epistemological or meta-epistemological doubts at all. And so I want to tie in Benjamin's notion of assuming responsibility and solitude to Arendt's view of the role of critical theory. And that'll be, in a way, a solution to that question. Bernstein writes about this in this wonderful book called Violence, Thinking Without Banisters. I think he's by far the best interpreter of Arendt that I know in Denken ohne Geländer, Thinking Without Banisters. And this is to an extent based on conversations I had with him. Thinking for Arendt has a special meaning. Banisters are the fixed points of knowledge, of traditional notions of understanding. Thinking is sharply distinguished from knowing and is not purposive in the positivistic sense of producing knowledge. It is not a means-end device, and so not scientific. Has no procedures, and its value cannot be determined by metaphors of production. I think this non-instrumental view is highly influenced by Heidegger's essay, The Gelassenheit on Thinking, but that would be for another time. Thinking, making sense of the world in which we live, in Bernstein terms, is an activity that must be performed over and over again. Okay, it's an activity, it's not a procedure. An activity that must be performed over and over again in order to keep it alive. There is always danger that thinking will disappear to be substituted by some non-thinking substitute. Arendt thought that this was highly practical, and I doubt that. One of the reasons why the appeal to banisters, writes Bernstein, or to foundations has been so seductive is because of the fear that the only other alternative is some sort of radical skepticism or nihilism. Bernstein shows how such a defensive mechanism against nihilism responds to what he calls a Cartesian anxiety that looks like Descartes to base all knowledge, including political, in some fundamental, immutable truth, a very monotheistic approach to knowledge. That, Arendt writes, is exactly the opposite of thinking. This, by the way, is a great reinterpretation of Aufklärung and the whole history of epistemology. In Many Dark Times, she writes, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass, regardless of results, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or condition them against it? An astounding proposition. The guard against evil is not law, or at least not only law, but a constant habit of thinking, of avoiding banister, of standing up to ideology. Without referring directly to Benjamin, Arendt gives a concrete sense to his phrase of assuming responsibility and solitude. Although she by no means considered thinking as solipsistic. I do not know, and I'm coming to my concluding remarks, I do not know how feasible Arendt's requirement is in practice. Sometimes, as Rorty writes, an instinctive rejection and a resistance to suffering and pain, which is the goal of education and not of philosophy. That was one of his greatest criticisms of philosophy. An instinctive rejection and resistance to suffering and pain is more morally relevant than all the introspection in the world put together. The constant involvement with the world, the thinking in the Arendtian sense requires, seems all too consuming. If we want a free society, it is, among other things, to be able to engage in other activities rather than to commit our intellectual, mental, social, and material resources to a constant political engagement that might even result in paranoia. However, the constant activity of thinking, then, has two roles. It requires action rather than passivity, and possibly mandates violent action in those extraordinary situations when refraining from it harms the conditions of politics more than engaging in it. And it keeps us from deteriorating from resistance to fanatics. Thinking in the sense of constant engagement with others and with the world, superimposed on the notion of the personal assumption of responsibility that cannot be outsourced to law, is the basis of the legitimacy of violent resistance and the shapes and means it takes. This brand of critical theory does not supply a recipe solution. There are no necessary and sufficient conditions here, but it does teach us that the first necessary condition for action is a constant, reflexive commitment and ability to critique it. Action must include its own reflexive criticism. Thank you very much.